Throughout this course, I've been trying to teach you the 6 essentials to recording a photographic image, because when you understand those 6 essentials, everything in photography relates back to one of them or a combination of them. Now, so far, we've looked at light, and remember that light comes in different colors. We can have hard light, we can have soft light, and it can dramatically affect the mood of our photograph. Number 3 on the list, I've deliberately left out number 2. Number 3 on the list is optics. And remember, we've got different focal length lenses, super wide angle, telephoto, and they can all give us different results with our photography. Then we have the aperture, which was the size of the hole in the lens that opens and closes to let more light in or less light in, and it also controlled that important thing called depth of field. After the aperture, we have to record time for a certain period, and that time was controlled by the shutter, and specifically the shutter speed. And again, we gave you some great demonstrations on varying shutter speeds and the effects that they give. Then we looked at the recording medium. That was finally the thing that captures the light, records the image, saves the image in the same way that film did. Now, that's 5 of the crucial, essential fundamentals of photography, of recording an image. But number 2 on that list is the subject. And the subject is what we choose to photograph. But not only what we choose to photograph, how we choose to photograph it. And this is very important because how we choose to photograph it is often defined as the composition of our image, how we lay the content of the photograph out for the most aesthetically pleasing results. So, what can we do to ensure good composition in our images? Well, a great starting point is a rule called the rule of thirds. Now, in front of me here, I've got a number of images, some of the ones that we actually shot on this course and some other ones as well. And I'm going to demonstrate the rule of thirds that you'll see become apparent that's actually already been used and already taken place. Let's start off with this image. I've got an acetate sheet. I'm just going to place over the image. It's the same size as the image. And if I divide this image up roughly into 1/3 zones, you will see that key points of interest fall on those 1/3 zone points. And this is very, very important because what we're trying to do to make our images more aesthetically pleasing is lay valuable content out on those 1/3 lines, either on the vertical line or on the horizontal line or at the intersection points. Now let's take a look at that again and see how that works. Now, in this image that I photographed on our advanced photography course with these 2 models, and you can see me shoot that on this course, you'll see if I lay the acetate sheet over, you can see how that rule of thirds is working really well. This model is lying directly on the intersection on that 1/3. This model's body is running the whole way down that third, the knees on that point, almost the head on that point. So the 1/3 layout is working really well. Now, you remember this shot that we did on shutter speeds. This was the image on shutter speeds, and you can see here, if I put the 1/3 grid over the top of that, look how closely the horizon lines up with the top third, the rocks on the top third. The key point of our composition, this big boulder here, right on the intersection of those 1/3 lines. So again, a really good demonstration of how that works. Let's take a look at this one. We have another image here. It's the same size, so I can just lay this grid over. This is the one we used in the putting it all together shoot. And we can see that key area, that's that area of the rocks and where the waves meet, that lovely area of contrast down there, and the reflection from the sun, and the sun's here, all of that's lining up on that 1/3 zone. That line of rocks is falling on the 1/3 zone. The edge of the rocks is coming close to the 1/3 zone. The horizon isn't quite on the 1/3 zone, but the line of top of the clouds is on that 1/3 zone. Let's move over to the other one that we did on the beach with the driftwood. Again, look how closely things start to match the 1/3 zone. That very important piece of driftwood falling in on the 1/3 zone there. the horizon, not exactly on the 1/3 zone, but close enough to it. Another shot from our advanced course here, where we did some light painting in Cornwall on the old tin mines. The tin mine itself lining up perfectly on that 1/3 zone, the other one over here, and the horizon line sort of falling on that 1/3 zone as well. Another example, not quite on the 1/3, but very close to it, is the model in one of our fashion and beauty courses. And you'll find in our portraiture work, that one's a little bit small, that acetate. Let's bring this one over. You'll see in our portraiture work, look at the line of the center of the head right down that 1/3 zone, and the eyes very close to the 1/3 zone, and the head predominantly on that 1/3 zone. So you can see there how the 1/3 rule has been applied pretty much over most of the images in this course. There are, however, exceptions. There are some images that just do not fall into the rule of thirds. If we look at some of these images here and here, you might question, well, how is the rule of thirds apparent in that when that item is in the middle of the photograph and that subject is in the middle of the photograph? Well, that's a very good question, and to look at some of the other compositional rules in more detail, let's head over to the computer. So let's take a look at some other areas of composition that fall outside the realms of the simple rule of thirds. There are actually a number of different compositional processes that we can use for our photography. The rule of thirds, of course, is a nice, easy one to become familiar with, and it's an easy one to follow. But let's take a look at something else as well. I'm going to open up a couple of images here, just so we can better understand what we're talking about. So let's open up our first image and take a look at a different form of composition. Now, in this image of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, you can see that our main subject is exactly centered in the photograph. Now, normally, that's not actually a good idea. This is why we use the rule of thirds, so that we can put our subject off to one side, away from the center. It's usually more visually interesting. But in this situation, it's acceptable because we're using something called symmetry. Let's just explore that and take a look at the shot in more detail. So if you can imagine where the center of the image is round about here somewhere. And what you'll notice is that our actual subject is a symmetrical shape either side of that center point. But the key thing to this is called leading lines, and that's afforded to us by this run of trees running down the side of the Champs-Élysées, down the side of the avenue here, that leads us to the center of the image. And then the same applies with the traffic and the lines of the road. Everything is directing our eye towards that central point. And then, because our subject is actually symmetrical around that central point, our eyes are guided into the subject and we're kind of locked into the shot. And that's the crucial thing about keeping the viewer locked into the picture. Let's take a look at another example. So in this example from one of our other courses, again, I've used symmetry. We're dealing with a basketball. Obviously, it's a symmetrical object, and you can see that it's actually got a symmetrical pattern on the basketball itself. And because of that, and because it's round and because it's centered, I can allow the image to, or allow the main subject to be centered, because everything is forming and falling to that center point. So what's happening in the shot are that the key areas of interest, which is obviously the splashing paint here and the splashing paint here, are kind of symmetrical, and they're symmetrical around the main subject. And then the intention is that your eyes are drawn in either side, because the impression is that the jets of liquid are coming in from the side, and that's the direction that the brain feels is natural, because the action is happening at that point. So again, in this instance, symmetry and centering the subject is acceptable. But if we only had one jet of liquid coming in from one side and not the other, then this shot would not work with this centralized composition. Let's take a look at an image that is slightly off symmetry, but still using a centralized composition. So in this image from one of our fashion and beauty lighting courses, we can see that I've placed my model very centralized in the shot, and there is a glow of light emanating around the model. I've asked the model to adopt a very symmetrical pose with the arms folded behind the back, same angles coming in either side, and this very regimental look front on to the shot. You also have, as I say, the glow of light around her, which is symmetrical, centralized, but you'll notice that she's looking off to one side, and her looking off to one side to this way helps balance out the fact that the jacket on this side is cut shorter. So again, we arrive at some balance and symmetry through the pose, whereas if she was looking this direction as well, it would unbalance the symmetry. So there are small little clever details that we can apply to the image which help balance it out for sometimes centralized composition, as in this case. Another example of symmetry with slightly off symmetry is this shot. Another shot from our fashion series of courses. And in this image, I'm using these strong lines leading us into the center. And these actual objects are kind of like a big arrow themselves. So they're pointing to our subject as well from either side. So this is the kind of arrow that's pointing in. This line is leading us in. This line is leading us in. So everything is taking us into this central part of action that's happening in here. But the key thing with this shot relies on other elements to do with anticipation, the moment, that decisive moment of capture, the expression. There is another element of interest in here that holds you as the viewer to keep looking at the shot. Very similar to the basketball shot where you want to study the splash and try and figure out how the shot was done and how that moment was captured. In this example, again, I've chosen to use symmetry, but there are some other compositional elements that are very important in this shot. The first one is juxtaposition of color. We have a very bright red and a very vivid blue. And those two colors compete with each other visually, which cause higher levels of contrast. And it basically makes the image look more lively. Your visual neurons are being more excited by those primary colors fighting against each other in there. And then that coupled with a slight blueness in the eyes and then the red on the lips kind of adds this whole element to the image. But the shot is by and large symmetrical in that our subject is mostly in the middle of the frame. But if we look at the off-balance elements of symmetry, the one that counters the other one, we'll find them quite easily. The first one is that this shoulder is lit very strongly down here, and that counteracts the off-symmetry of the fact that this item goes up or the hood around it goes up to this point at that side of the image. So we're counterbalancing the offset, if you like, of the symmetry with those 2 points. Further examples of helping guide the eye into the picture is actually the light itself hitting this shoulder. We generally like to read into images from left to right, and we're drawn into areas of high contrast first. We'll definitely be drawn into faces and facial recognition first. That's one of the key elements of focus of our visual system, but we also look for areas of high contrast. And this image is abundant in areas of high contrast, not only in the face, the sharp shadows, but this area of bright light on the shoulder here, this very high contrast edge here where the strong line of red meets the blue. But of course, as I said, we're going to be drawn into the face area immediately as part of our visual awareness system, where we're drawn into recognizing and assessing human expression to see whether or not the subject is a friend or foe. Let's take a look at another example of juxtaposition in color. Now, this particular image was completely designed with that in mind. So the colors that you can see in this shot, the blue background, the vivid blue areas here, and this particular color of orange in here are actually opposite colors on the color additive spectrum. So those two colors are competing with each other quite aggressively in terms of contrast, luminosity, etc. And that excites your visual systems. So I've deliberately used those colors to excite your visual systems and make the image come alive more. And this is something that's often done in advertising photography, and it's one of the techniques that we use, where sometimes we'll take the key subject or the key component color, and then we'll use a background color that is the opposite to that color or contradictory to that color to offset the subject and make it pop out of the frame more. Another commonly used photography compositional rule is called framing. Now, framing is demonstrated very well in this particular image. We can see that our main subject is obviously the house in the photograph and the lovely twilight blue glow behind the house, but I framed the image with trees. So basically we're looking through something to see the main subject. And this is another commonly used compositional technique, and it also helps by adding three-dimensionality to our two-dimensional picture, because we then have elements in the foreground that are juxtaposed against our element of our main subject in the background. And turn that off, you can see that framing using the trees and seeing the main subject through the framing element. Let's look at another example of framing. This one's done more discreetly, but this is in an advertising product still life type shot. And again, this is a shot that we filmed in one of our other courses on product photography. But you can see the line of liquid around the subject here that's holding the subject in place. So essentially we are framing our subject with a compositional element that locks the subject and locks the viewer into that space. Here's another example of framing and occlusion. So I've framed my subject through the woodwork in the shot here, which adds interest, adds another dynamic to the shot, but also occlusion and that shallower depth of field gives a more enhanced sense of three-dimensionality, because what we're seeing are two sort of depth of field levels here. One that you can appreciate is in the foreground of the shot, and then your main subject further back from that. But using those foreground elements to frame the subject so we're looking through something. Now, this particular image does follow the rule of thirds, but it also uses other elements in the composition to help the shot. The first one is similar to symmetry, but more associated with balance. If we look at this line of headland coming in from this side, we also have a line of headland coming in from this side. So that kind of locks you into the shot on either side, whereas if we didn't have one part of the headland on one side, you may tend to drift out that side of the frame. Now that's further enhanced by the fact that we also have a sort of general pointing direction of these rocks from this side and a general pointing direction of rocks from these side, again locking us into the frame, balancing the shot either side. And of course, one of the key areas that we're going to be drawn to is the sun. and all of these compositional elements are guiding us in that direction, in towards the sunset, which is obviously one of the key parts of the photograph. The other key area of the photograph are the sweeping waves in this area here, the rocks catching the light, and this rock here. So again, they're all locked within the frame from those other compositional elements which give great balance to the shot. And this particular shot is a tutorial within our landscape photography section. Composition can also be somewhat more complex on occasion, as in this case. In this particular image, I wanted the viewer to be drawn in with the brand name from the lower left. They take the direction into the shot this way because the lipstick is directing you in that way. You're formed at a barrier here, so you kind of bounce off of the image and go back down that way, and then you arrive here, and then you're pointed back down this direction. So you end up in a circular motion within the shot through these two key compositional elements, and you're avoided from exiting on the right here because again this element sort of points you back into the shot as well. So the way I compose images and the process I use is very carefully thought out sometimes, especially in advertising images, to guide your eye into the shot, to lead you in and to keep you in the shot and to try and avoid you from escaping from the image. Often, good composition is a complex process made to look simple. People viewing the final picture don't necessarily know why they like it. It just has a feeling about it that captures their imagination. More complex composition is something that does take time to learn, but the more you practice, the easier it gets. Often it's a case of going with your instinct on what feels right, and while some people have a more natural ability at identifying good composition, it is still something you can learn. The most important objective is to keep your viewer connected to your image. The longer they want to look at an image, then the more successful you've been in creating an effective photograph. It's important to remember that the connection to the viewer is driven by several factors other than composition. It can include emotion, anticipation, curiosity, and narrative. And these are often elements that I deliberately include in my own work to further enhance the viewer's experience. Emotion can be brought to an image by the way I light a shot, and anticipation and narrative are elements that I regularly include, as well as decisive moments that enhance a viewer's curiosity. To expand your skill set, start exploring our next level courses where you can hone your skills using your camera in manual mode and employing your knowledge of the 6 essentials. Your next steps could be to explore our travel or landscape photography courses, where I guide you to creating stunning images with just basic camera equipment. Here, I also introduce you to other useful tools such as filters or tripods to create amazing night cityscapes, or even astrophotography and light painting. Or you can also get confident shooting people with our natural light portraiture courses, where I show you just how much you can achieve with just a camera and a reflector, and what great results you can get and what gear you need to do it. From there, the sky's the limit. With our studio lighting courses for fashion, beauty, and portraiture, you can solve some of the complex lighting problems of product and still life photography, and many of my great examples are achieved just using one light and undertaken in a small space. On top of that, we've also got Photoshop, Lightroom, and post-production courses covered that will make your images pop, as well as marketing yourself as a photographer. It's all here in our platform, and it includes monthly live photography shows where you can ask questions and watch me shoot a variety of subjects live, as well as solving and explaining the more complex areas of photography with great results straight out of the camera. And all our live shows are available on replay. So I hope you enjoyed this free course on learning to master your camera in manual mode and understanding those 6 essential things to recording a photographic image. And I'd really appreciate it if you could tell your friends about this free course and share it with anyone you know who has an interest in photography. Oh, and don't forget, you can download our comprehensive PDF guide that also accompanies this course. Thanks for watching, and I hope this helps inspire you to get out there and get shooting, and I look forward to guiding you even further on our next level courses.